Okay, thank you, Chase. And next week's Bergen Forum is Meg Bernstein, art historian, and she is giving a talk entitled Between Heaven and Hell in Medieval England. And that was before Brexit. Right? Today, we're very happy to have Kathy Sherman. Kathy is the Certification and Placement Officer here in the Division of Education. She was the director of the Montessori School, and she and Chase went to high school together, so they go back 15, 16 years. Right? Right. Okay, 20 years, sorry. Kathy, take it away. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. So thank you for coming to the presentation today. And I do have to give a special shout out to Chase, who convinced me to do this. She's literally been convincing me to do things since we were in 7th grade. Most of them have been good. Others, I'll leave that for another day. Nonetheless, welcome to Book Bans, Battles, and Beliefs, teaching US history in the era of fake news. Or should I say, teaching any subject in the era of Ron DeSantis. Let me start by telling you a bit about my background. I taught in 2 middle schools in Seattle for a combined total of 27 years. I taught 6th through 8th grade humanities, social studies, and language arts. Both middle schools had total populations larger than every school district in Allegheny County. Very different around here. Every year I had a student load in the range of 150 to 185 students whom I saw every day. The students were diverse in race, ethnicity, country of origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, and languages spoken. Every year I had classes with European Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans, along with immigrants who just arrived in the country from China, Russia, Vietnam, Somalia, and Eritrea. I had students who were transgender, queer, questioning, and gay. I had students who were undocumented, students who were in gangs, and students who were homeless. I started teaching in 1991, so I was in the classroom when busing still existed, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when Rodney King was beaten, when OJ was chased in his white Bronco, during the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela, during the genocide in Rwanda, 9/11, both Iraq wars, Columbine, Virginia Tech, and Sandy Hook, when the 2008 banking crisis occurred, when the Black Lives Matter movement started after Trayvon Martin's death, and on the day Trump was elected president. As a result of so much diversity in my classrooms and so much of the world crashing into my students, my goal was to always build a strong classroom community. This was difficult in many classes in many years, but I always found that my goal was the same. It was as important to build relationships with my students as it was to teach the content of history or language arts. I worked to maintain a safe and authentic space for students to be themselves and be able to talk about their lived experiences. Current events intruded on our curriculum on a daily basis. There is no way to teach in this country without bringing these events into the classroom. They impact students far beyond what we realize, and students need space to process them. While many people, including teachers, believe that teachers make political decisions every day when we teach history, I disagree. We make decisions every day about what we include and how we include it, but this is not political in my mind. This is the reality of only having 180 days to teach a huge amount of content and to provide students with the ability to delve into the work of historians and examine events from multiple perspectives. Even in progressive Seattle, we got pushback from parents at times about discussing race, ethnicity, and the reality of our country's history. I always started the year teaching US history by letting students know that our history is full of some incredible people and accomplishments, but that it is also full of grave injustices and horrendous treatment of other humans. We will never grow as an informed citizenry if we hide the truth of our history. We must teach students that our history impacts our current situations and that much more work must be done to truly make the United States a place of liberty and justice for all. Now I need my clicker. Okay, now throughout this presentation, I'm gonna ask for a little audience participation, Chase's favorite thing. So your first assignment is to do just a quick think in your own head, not talking to anyone else yet. You'll get a chance to do that. What did you learn about Columbus in middle and or high school? Just ponder for a second. Okay, now comes the next part. You're gonna have to be brave and find someone to talk to, or at least pretend to talk so it looks like you're following the directions. The first question is, what do you remember learning about Columbus in those times? High school, middle school, not college. Go. Okay, now go with the second question. What was not taught that needed to be taught? You're talking now. This is still in the turn and talk phase. Talking. And then you can move on to the third question if you're ready. And then it'll give you about 15 more seconds. Okay, finish up your conversations. All right, now a different kind of audience participation, but this is real easy. So raise your hand if you and your partner had mostly answers that were similar. Okay, raise your hands if you had mostly answers that were different. Okay, so one thing to think about is that a lot of the differences, I would guess, are based on where and when you went to school. Things have changed a lot over the years. So that wasn't too difficult, I hope, on the participation. So much of what we were taught and when we were taught was and still is influenced by when we were in school and where we were in school. The reality, as we now know it, is that America was not discovered by Columbus. Indigenous peoples have been living on the islands he landed on for thousands of years. But not until a shift occurred in education and classrooms were more centered around examining primary sources, little was taught about his treatment of the Taino people, which included kidnapping many, torturing them when they did not find enough gold, and planning to enslave most of the population. This drawing shows Columbus's men literally chopping off the hands of the Taino people who were either deemed as disobedient to them or for not producing enough gold. Columbus should definitely not be left out of teaching history, but he certainly should not be revered as the person who discovered America. Rather, he was the person who opened up the West Indies for massive trading among the continents, which came to be known as the Columbian Exchange. This was a major turning point in history, although what came to be exchanged, of course, is also problematic. Since the early 90s, there's been a movement to stop the celebration of Columbus and instead honor Indigenous peoples. South Dakota, believe it or not, was the first state to officially celebrate the day in 1990. The city of Berkeley, California, embraced Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992 as a protest to the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival. The city of Seattle adopted Indigenous Peoples Day in 2014, and the Seattle School Board followed suit in 2016. The school board's resolution stated that we recognize the fact that Seattle is built upon the homelands and villages of the indigenous peoples of this region, without whom the building of the city would not have been made possible. The resolution also, says the board, has a responsibility to oppose the systematic racism towards indigenous peoples in the United States, which perpetuates high rates of poverty and income inequality, exacerbating disproportionate health, education, and social crises. For the first time ever, on Monday, October 11th, 2021, New York State recognized Indigenous Peoples Day. Despite this recognition, though, many schools in New York State still honor Columbus, and it's a day off for students. So I'm going to give you a few examples. This is Alfred Almond's calendar from the school year, and Hornell's calendar, and Canisteo Greenwood's calendar. On the other hand, Seattle Public Schools calendar, Portland Public Schools calendar, in Oregon, not Maine, and the Los Angeles Unified School District calendar. Now, they definitely don't say Indigenous Peoples Day, but they also don't honor Columbus Day, and it is not a day off for students. I started with Columbus because how we teach and learn about his life and accomplishments is an example of how hard it is to change the narrative. We still honor Columbus Day in many places in our country. Andrew Jackson is still on the $20 bill, despite an effort since 2014 to change the picture to Harriet Tubman. And let's be honest, the South is still not over what they call the War of Northern Aggression. Teaching US history needs to focus on the use of primary sources, needs to teach students how to do the work of real historians. This is a picture of Robert Caro, who wrote the 4-volume Pulitzer Prize-winning The Years of Lyndon Johnson. It needs to look at multiple perspectives and accounts of an event, and needs to draw students to further research and reflection. Teaching of US history should never focus only on the victors or a Eurocentric bent, should never leave out voices of indigenous peoples, immigrants, those enslaved, nor those disenfranchised for any reason. Above all, the teaching of US history should never be dictated by politicians. On to the issue of book bans. The biggest reason books are banned is out of fear. Fear that students will learn something that families don't want them to learn. Fear that students will be influenced to change who they are. And fear that students will be uncomfortable if their previous beliefs are challenged. Politicians are not afraid to ban books as a result. What they won't ban is guns. Books are not killing kids, but gun violence is a leading cause of death for young people in our country right now. Since when did the pages of a book become scarier than an AK-47? With this next question, you're going to do another quick turn and talk, and I want you to try and guess which state has the most banned books. So, turn and talk. I bet you might come up with the first choice. Okay, any guesses? You want to shout it out? Okay. Okay, so I'll give you the big reveal. So the current statistics. Number 1, Texas with 801. Number 2, not surprising, Florida with 566. 3 is Pennsylvania, I know, 457. And 4 is Tennessee with 349. So I'm going to show you a few book covers of books that have been banned in Texas in particular. So this is when Wilma Rudolph played basketball. A parent in a Dallas suburb said this illustrated children's book, which touches on the racism that Olympian Wilma Rudolph experienced growing up in Tennessee in the 1940s, should be removed from school libraries because it opines prejudice based on race. A parent asked administrators at the Spring Branch School District in Houston to pull this graphic novel, which features gay and bisexual characters, because she claimed it might lead young students to question their sexual orientation when they don't even comprehend what that means. According to another Houston parent, reading this novel about a Black boy killed by police might cause white children who attend school to feel ashamed based on the color of their skin. A parent in Prosper, Texas said this novel, which tells the story of 9/11 and its aftermath from the dueling perspectives of an American boy and an Afghan girl, should be removed from schools because it depicts American soldiers as callous, evil, and terrorists, and because the author mentions the racial or ethnic identities of every character. And this young adult adaptation of Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi's National Book Award-winning historical examination of racism, was flagged for removal by a parent in Katy, Texas, who wrote that the children's book is littered with completely fabricated and conspiracy theory views on history that make it seem as if all historical events of the past were a result of racism. Most of us remember learning about big events and documents in US history: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, Industrial Revolution, westward expansion, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Again, depending on when and where you grew up, how these things were taught varied in major ways. So one more chance for audience participation, because I don't want to get you too bored. So the next question is, what was included and what is left out in terms of your middle and high school history classes? So I want you to give me a thumbs up if you learned about this event in one of your classes in middle or high school, a thumbs down if you didn't. And kind of look around to see how people respond, because it, again, might give you some context for where and when people went to school. So thumbs up if you learned about Manifest Destiny. Thumbs down if you learned about the Indian Removal Act. Thumbs up if you learned about the Founding Fathers dedicated to liberty. Thumbs down if you learned about Founding Fathers who owned slaves. Thumbs up if you learned about US government treaties with Native Americans. Thumbs down if you learned about Native American children sent to boarding schools. Thumbs up if you learned about Reconstruction improving the lives of African Americans. Thumbs down if you learned about lynching, segregation, and the KKK. Thumbs up if you learned about Brown versus Board of Education. Thumbs down if you learned about the Little Rock Nine. Thumbs up if you learned about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Thumbs down if you learned about Japanese internment. So just looking around, you can see there's a variety of how people responded, and just by my own little quick survey, it really does depend a lot on when you went to school, and I'm guessing where as well. The parade of facts was a common term for how history was taught in the 70s and 80s. Teachers would present fact after fact after fact, and students worked to commit these facts to memory. Then the move came to teaching big events in history and really focusing on how they were shaped by what came before and what came after. There was a big push in the early 2000s to cover depth versus breadth, focusing on fewer events, but delving into them more deeply. From there, more and more teaching became centered on using primary sources and multiple perspectives to analyze events, providing students with the opportunity to draw their own conclusions about what happened. And then comes the pushback. Book bans and pushback on what is taught in US history classrooms is not new. However, the current pushback is more concerning because we are losing ground, not gaining ground in teaching accurate history. The last book Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote was called Where Do We Go From Here in 1967. It was a reflection on what he saw as the issues ahead in the civil rights movement. And he said, whites, it must be frankly said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. The reality of substantial investment to assist Negroes into the 20th century, adjusting to Negro neighbors and genuine school integration is still a nightmare for all too many Americans. These are the deepest causes for contemporary abrasions between the races. Loose and easy language about equality and resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear. But for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forwards accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. Keeping those words in mind from 1967, this next quote is from Ibram Kendi, who's the founder and director of the Center for Anti-Research at Boston University. And this is from an interview in 2017. He says, "We have been taught that ignorance and hate lead to racist ideas, lead to racist policies. If the fundamental problem is ignorance and hate, then your solutions are going to be focused on education and love and persuasion. But of course," and he's referencing his book, Stand for the Beginning, that book shows that the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic and political and cultural. Self-interest drives racist policies that benefit that self-interest. When the policies are challenged because they produce inequalities, racist ideas spring up to justify those policies. Hate flows freely from there. More recently, from a 2007-2021 interview at the AFT's Teach Conference, Kendi reinforced that teaching about racism is crucial if we want students to understand and recognize racism. He compared racism to his experience with metastatic cancer, which he describes in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. To ignore cancer because it makes someone feel uncomfortable to talk about it would be unacceptable. And in his case, would have prevented him from getting the treatments he needed to get healthy. If people act as though there is no racism, the country will never heal. In her article, We Have Been Deprived the True History, Martha Beretta states that people are fearful of true history because it will expose the hypocrisy between the stated American ideals and the reality of life for many Americans. In addition, the myth that American society is defined by human liberty, justice, and equality, and that America is the greatest and most tolerant nation will be revealed. Rachel Cohen, in her article entitled Why Teachers Are Afraid to Teach History, states parents express worry that white students feel discomfort when they are exposed to the realities of systemic racism. One white parent she interviewed, Chrissy Erickson, is quoted in the article as saying, "The only real privilege we need to reflect on is the privilege we all have to live here in the United States of America." Don Goldstein's 2022 article, How US Textbooks Helped Instill White Supremacy, reviews how mainstream publishers of US history textbooks are not making significant enough changes in the narrative of US history. There is still very little coverage of events and issues that represent how the US gained its land and of the blatant discrepancies in how people have been and are treated based on race. So what fear produces is bills upon bills upon bills regulating what is taught in schools. So I'm going to share just a few examples of these from around the country. In Texas, March 2021, a law was passed banning class discussions of controversial topics and the 1619 Project. In Virginia in 2022, Governor Youngkin issued an executive order that forbids schools to require students to adopt or affirm certain ideas about race or ethnicity. In Iowa in 2022, 4 new laws were pending, including one that forbids any negative comments about the Pledge of Allegiance, and another that forbids requiring teachers to discuss any controversial issues. There's a theme here. In Georgia in 2022, HB 1088 bans educators from talking about divisive concepts, such as the US is fundamentally racist. In Michigan in 2022, bills presented that ban the 1619 Project and forbid teaching of anti-American and racist theories. In Florida in 2022, Ron DeSantis banned the 1619 Project. HB 1557 is the Don't Say Gay bill. SB 242 and 148 aim to ban anything that makes students feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish. New Hampshire 2022, HB 1255, would forbid teachers to present any negative portrayals of the Founding Fathers. In Missouri, since the start of 2022, 16 bills have been put forward banning everything from divisive concepts to certain ideas about race and sex, and students must be presented with a positive picture of US history. Colorado, February 2022, HB 1206 prohibits promoting certain ideas related to race, sex, or ethnicity. And unfortunately, this is just a small list of the more than 30 states who have introduced similar types of legislation in the past few years. Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. Critical race theorists hold that racism is inherent in the law and legal institutions of the United States, insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. Think back to the events I asked about earlier in terms of whether you learned about them or not. As I said, so much of what we learn depends on where and when we went to school. The way I taught US history was incredibly different from how I learned about it. My colleagues and I focused our teaching on the belief that students need to know more than just what is in a textbook. They need to see and feel and experience events from multiple perspectives and sides. We do our students a huge injustice when we shelter them from the reality of how our country was founded and formed. Fear inhibits this kind of accurate teaching. Fear leads to bills and laws and school board decisions that end up stifling what teachers can teach. Fear continues to promote the false narrative that racism is not ingrained in our history. Fear suppresses any authentic dialogue about race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender. Fear ends up producing students who are not only miseducated, but also unprepared to live in the world. If students do not have the opportunity to learn about the reality of our history, they will not have the tools to make positive changes. Students can handle learning that the US government stole land from Native Americans. They can handle learning the realities of slavery. They can handle learning about Reconstruction and Jim Crow and lynchings because they are living in a country today that is reeling from the ongoing systemic racism fraught out of these events. From the brutal murder of George Floyd, to the expulsion of Justin Jones and Justin Pearson from the Tennessee State Legislature, we are living in a country that has clearly not learned from its past. In addition, if we continue to teach only parts of our history, students of color will continue to feel unrepresented, unheard, unseen, and yes, uncomfortable. Students will not learn how to discuss important, crucial issues using evidence to support their ideas. Students will be cheated out of the opportunity to grapple with the reality of our history, and therefore cheated out of the opportunity to promote change for their generation. The Florida problem. Ron DeSantis is the Florida problem. Why do I include him when we are not bound by any of the irrational and harmful decisions he has made regarding how schools teach in Florida? I do so for several reasons. Number one, he actively fought against the AP African American History course, which was one of the reasons the College Board actually changed the curriculum. Number two, he's been around the country expounding on his beliefs to grow support for his education agenda, which leads to the coming reality that number three, he is most likely going to throw his hat in the ring for the presidential election. If he is elected, this will be devastating for public schools around the country. So what can we do? We can promote use of inclusive textbooks in K through 12 classrooms. These are just a few of the examples that provide a more inclusive study of US history. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and the Young People's Version, Stamp, Anti-Racism, Racism and You, A Queer History of the United States, Rethinking Columbus, and A Different Mirror for Young People. If you have children in school, inquire about the resources that are being used and consider sharing some of these resources. Look into resources for fighting book bans. One example is the book ban toolkit put together by Unite Against Book Bans. They provide practical ideas and talking points for conversations with people in your community. In addition, Banned Book Week is October 1st through 7th, 2023. There are multiple websites with ideas on how to take action against banning books. Email U.S. Senators Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand, and also Miguel Cardona, the Secretary of Education, among others, to remind them how crucial it is that U.S. history be taught with accuracy across the country. Build bridges with and among people who view things differently than you do. This book, Rising Out of Hatred, is an amazing example of what friendship and ongoing conversations can do to change people's viewpoint. It's about a white supremacist whose father was a grandmaster of the KKK, whose godfather is David Duke, and how he came to denounce these beliefs through building friendships with people who challenged him over time. Vote. While we still have a democracy in this country, we all need to show that we support and believe what we support and believe in by voting every time in every election. I put together a list of resources based on this presentation, along with my bibliography. It's behind the coffee. I just placed it back there earlier. So feel free to pick up this handout on your way out. My closing thought from the article, Why Teachers Are Afraid to Teach History by Rachel Cohen. As communities continue to spar, it will be students who pay the price for the laws, rules, and cultural pressures that deter educators from tackling so-called divisive subjects. A wealth of research from both nationally representative samples of schools and individual schools has shown that students who are encouraged to discuss controversial issues are more likely to develop civic tolerance, political interests, a sense of civic duty, and expectations of voting than their peers without similar classroom experiences. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kathy. Could I ask if people have questions, comments, and use the microphone for the sake of the people on Zoom?
Oh, no question.
Does anyone here know the current situation in our school district about banned books?
With being on the school board right now, the answer is no. And part of why the answer is no is our current school board president, who's familiar to most of the people in this room, Earl Pierce, has so far completely refused to even entertain a discussion of that sort of topic. And so hopefully that will continue. I do have a comment more than a question.
Yes.
When you were pointing out about kind of like the timing of somebody's education on whether or not they were thumbs upping or thumbs downing or when they learn stuff. I'm not that old, but close to 30 years is a little hard to remember back at this point. But I feel like some of the side type stuff where the real history, I probably actually learned in my AP history class. And so I think that since the AP curriculum is aligned more with college curriculum, I think that a lot of times students who are taking AP classes at the high school level are probably getting exposed to things that are probably considered more accurate by at least most of the people in this room.
And I would agree with that. I think one of the issues in public schooling is access to things like AP courses and who gets access and who doesn't. So that's another issue in all of this.
Thank you, Kathy. As you know, I teach history, and And so as you're talking about this, I wanted to ask for some more of your thoughts. So as you might know, it's sometimes really difficult to get students to read anything. And so one criticism I've heard is that, well, kids don't read books anyway, so who really cares what's in the library or not? They weren't reading them before. But I think as your presentation suggests, this isn't just about the book. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, maybe about that criticism that people are making, or just about like the broader implications. If it's not just about the book, then what is it about?
Mhm. I mean, you're right. That's always the like pushback of kids don't want to read. What are they going to read? What do they like to read? And one of the just online webinars I heard recently was about talking about how you build even a classroom library. And they spoke about how often we give students choice, which is a good thing because they can choose what they're interested in and what their passions are about. But in addition to that, we have to put front and center books that we feel like everyone needs to know about. So we're not just saying, well, this is something that you could learn, but no, what do we want all students to learn? And I think it really is trying to figure out how do we engage students in different ways. Sometimes it's focusing on articles. And I think what we learned teaching middle school in particular is that using primary sources, all of a sudden students were like, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe so-and-so's saying this. And so I think sometimes it's not just, it's kind of integrating books and articles and different ways of showing about history that can make the difference. Does that help at all?
Next question.
Since you were head of Montessori, I guess I have a strong feeling that all of this stuff begins far below schools, first grade, kindergarten, so on. Have you found in looking at other, now I know Montessori is a bit of a different ballgame, but in daycare and other situations for very young children, how can we begin to shape a much more liberal and realistic viewpoint for these young kids so that they're not sharply changing as they get into school? I think it has to start at home.
Absolutely. And it has to start young because so many of our beliefs come out of what we learn from our families, our parents, our surroundings. There's definitely a push in early childhood education to implement more curriculum that is giving students a more diverse look at our history. And of course, you know, one of the things people are like, well, is it too early for them to learn? There's always ways to present information that is age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. And so it's making sure that even in early childhood education, students are learning about things that are a reality of our history and that need to be known in order to grow as citizens.
Well, I just graduated high school last year, and I was really involved in like activism and stuff at the high school and the school board level. What would you say for, you know, kids who are in that position who feel like they can't really make much change because of the way administration is set up? It just feels like you can't get anything done.
I know that feeling from being a teacher and a lot of pushback in different situations. It is hard. I think, I mean, the goal and the reality is we have to keep pushing. And even when you don't see the change happening right away, it's important not to let it go because it's only through people and more people and more people pushing for change is that going to happen. It's difficult though, and it's really frustrating because you feel like you're not getting anywhere. But I think the more conversation that happens, I think that book is a really great example of how when we talk with people and really try and understand them and listen and also kind of reflect back what they're feeling, that it can make a difference. But it's hard. So good for you for pushing back.
Okay, I have a question. About banned books. Are there states like Massachusetts, California, New York, Vermont, are these states where there are no banned books at all in schools?
No, there are some that don't really have any statewide banned books, but I would say almost every state has some district that's banning something. And that's gone on for years and years and years, way before this era.
And so it's entirely up to the district whether they ban a book.
It depends. So in Florida, DeSantis is really pushing what's happening in schools, from curriculum to books and everything, even though he often says that that's not the case. But generally, school districts are the ones that make that decision. And generally, it's based on how parents respond to a particular book or what their child is reading. Does that answer your question?
As a board member of our local library, there's a great deal of concern among libraries in the Southern Tier system of people coming in, wanting to film the collection and so forth. There are now policies being developed. So we are seeing evidence of this, although maybe not out there in the foreground, but it's a real issue among librarians.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of the librarians that I worked with were amazing in our middle schools, and they were all against banning books. And their philosophy is we need to have students exposed to every kind of book that's available. As a family, you can decide, you know what, I don't want you to read that right now. Doesn't mean you ban it for everybody else.
Yeah, you began by saying that you're offering a kind of objective history. That's the kind of, rather than a politicized. Do you consider your own perspective here political?
Good question. I actually don't, because we have to look at what happened in history. And yes, I would say I lean definitely more towards the liberal bias or bent. But if we don't approach teaching history and approach banning books in a way that allows students and everybody to learn about what's really happened in our history, then I think we're doing them a disservice.
And secondly, you mentioned, Kendi and so forth. You began with some comments about Columbus. You mentioned the 1619 project. You had a slide about the 1619. There are some very, very good historians, really top-notch historians, who have been very critical of the 1619 project. Why is that?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think a lot of times people, like a historian, will look at it in terms of how content is presented and what order it's presented in. I think sometimes it's looked at in terms of where is the story being told and who's telling it. I think in any book about history, there's always going to be pushback on certain things just because that's what we tend to do. Just like there's pushback on the 1776 project by other people.
Well, I mean, I'm a historian,
Yeah.
like Mallory, and I find certain elements of the 1619 project. I'm probably one of the very few people in this room who has actually read the 1619 project. I'd be curious. How many people here have actually read the 1619 project? Oh, a very small number. So, for instance, on Lincoln, okay, the 1619 project emphasizes the fact that Lincoln argued for preserving the Western territories for white settlement. He did want to, be elected president, of course, and that he said at one point in 1858 that it's unlikely that blacks would ever be accepted as social equals to whites and so forth. And the 1619 project emphasizes this. But what the 1619 project ignores is the fact that Frederick Douglass would say after the Civil War that that Lincoln was not only the greatest president in American history, but the greatest president for that former slave population. In other words, it's a very one-sided view of history. And that's why I think that many really top-notch historians like Alan Gelzo, like Willens from Princeton, who are certainly Willens is politically quite far left, but they have been very, very critical of a project that is in many ways partial. Okay, it's simply not the very kind of complete view of history that you are proposing here. And I guess my final point is really an observation that, while you might not consider your presentation political, from my perspective, and I agree with a lot of what you say, certainly everything that you're saying about banned books, I consider it to be very, very political. And that may simply be the nature of our craft.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, again, if you think about Lincoln and what Frederick Douglass had to say, you could write a whole book just about that particular issue. And so I think it's always choosing what you put in and what you leave out. But I agree with you, absolutely.
Kathy, would you like to comment on the first question in the chat and then?
Sure. Sure. So question 1, it says, as a woman, learning more about discrimination against women is informative, but it is also traumatic. I feel powerless, angry, and victimized. While I agree that education is essential to create positive change, just as you pointed out in the case of race, women are often the ones taking on this burden due to privilege blinding others to their laziness. How can we encourage others to overcome their own blindness to their ignorance and do the work of educating themselves and becoming advocates? It's a great question. Again, it's hard because there's so much trauma related to a lot of these topics, a lot of the things that are happening in our world today. And I think it's about building individual relationships, building those conversations over time that's eventually going to hopefully make change. But it's a constant kind of back and forth in terms of how people deal with that in terms of their own comfort and in terms of how they want to be engaged.
The question asked in the chat is quite close to mine. But my reaction or question is, what would we do about banning books, say, by David Dukes? How do we help teach critical thinking, critical reading? I think that's a key. Do you have clues?
Well, I think that's again why we don't ban any books, because there needs to be access to all different kinds of viewpoints. Again, that book about the white nationalist, it's an incredible story about how people in their conversations and in continuing to have conversations, even when he pushed back so much, but they kept going and they kept building that. And I think it is a matter of showing students, again, primary sources, so that they're looking at lots of people's viewpoints, different perspectives, to start figuring out, what do I believe about history as a result of what I've read, so that it is more than just one side or one perspective.
Hi there. I'm sort of coming at this. I'm a librarian here at the university, but before that, I did teach high school in an international setting and outside Chicago. And I appreciate this discussion very much. And I kind of want to maybe turn on a more positive note. So in the international setting, school used an international baccalaureate curriculum. I was really impressed with that curriculum and how it approaches facts, how it approaches consensus building within an argument and the like. And so I was curious if there are any examples of curriculum or school districts that are really doing it right.
There are, I think, and from my experience, it has tended to be more school by school than necessarily full district. That was one of my frustrations when I left the Seattle Public Schools. Having taught there for 27 years, we were still talking about the same issues in terms of achievement and in terms of how students learned that we were talking about when I started. What we did in our school, so we did have an American history textbook that was adopted by the school district. We actually seldom used it. We left it on the shelves, and we used Howard Zinn's A Young People's History of the United States. So I think a lot of individual teachers and schools are making some of those decisions. I would need to do more research to see if any district-wide, things are happening in that regard, because there are so many factors in how all that takes place. And like in Seattle, you've got a district with over 150 schools, and regulating who's teaching what and how they're teaching it seems to be a very difficult problem.
I mean, I guess my maybe a question and a statement. I mean, isn't book banning just essentially un-American activity? I mean, it seems like very undemocratic.
Yes.
It's un-American, right?
Yeah. And it's been going on for years and years and years. It's been going on for people like on the left that have wanted things banned, on the right that have wanted things banned. Yes, that is kind of political. But it is something that we're censoring what students can see or what they can read, and also not allowing people to have that chance to figure out, based on what I've read and what I've learned, how can I decide what I believe? So I would agree with you.
Last question from the chat. Could you read it out loud and then
Yes.
respond to it, Kathy?
So I can understand parental concerns about what we teach our children. We need more diverse materials that engages with controversial topics, but that must also be tempered by inclusion of stories where real progress is made, where people who play a role in that progress are honored, and where narratives are encourage positive behaviors. We want children feeling empowered instead of victimized in a system where they have little power. How can we ensure that all children are being offered narratives that are psychologically healthy for them and model positive behaviors and role models while also educating them about difficult and traumatic topics? Much of the book banning seems to come from parental worry about trauma. So if we solve this issue, we might garner more support for covering controversial topics. So that's a really good question, because when I was teaching in a diverse classroom of students, how people perceive different things is huge. And I would have conversations with African-American students who would say, I can't hear this anymore. Can we look at this from a different perspective? And we talk about how important it is to share what are the positive things that have happened for a group of people or for people individually. How do we show that despite everything that's happened, there is incredible progress made in some situations? There has to be that balance. But again, it's conversations that are hard to have in a 50-minute classroom. And so really kind of delving into how do we approach that. It's something that needs to be done more often.
Thank you, Kathy, for a great talk on a very interesting, important topic.
Thank you. Woo-hoo.